throughout a chess game, you should always be looking to activate your pieces. Activate just means to get that material involved into the game. If we think about both sides, if one side were to start the game without a rook, most sides would say that white has a massive advantage. A rook is a very powerful piece. It's a major piece, and to start the game without a rook would be a huge disadvantage. But many players go an entire chess game and they don't move one of their pieces. If you don't move your piece, it's as if that piece did not exist. So, when you're playing a chess game and you're thinking about how you're going to develop a strategy, always be thinking about how you can get your pieces involved into the game. Let's take a look at the beginning of a chess game, and white starts with e4, and black responds with f6. Now, f6 is not a very good move, even though this pawn here on f6 does control the central square here on e5. You want to make sure that you're getting your pieces involved into the game and that they are very active pieces. This knight here would like to come to f6, a very active square for the knight, but it's blocked off by this f6 pawn. Let's say that white continues with d4, trying to control the center of the board, and now black says he wants to get his knight involved into the game, so the knight comes here to h6. White now decides to get his own knight involved into the game, and he brings his knight to f3. When we talk about active pieces, we want to be thinking about how much of the board the piece can control. You can see this knight here on h6. At any given time, it can move to 4 squares. It's on a dark square, so it's always going to move to a light square, and you can see at no point can it move beyond these 4 squares. If we look at this white knight here on f3, although it is blocked by some of the squares, at some point it could move to many more squares. There are 8 potential squares that the knight can move to at some point. So we would say that this knight here on f3 is much more active than the knight here on h6. Let's say the play continues with black playing pawn to e6 and white plays bishop to c4. The bishop here on f1 is controlling this light square diagonal, but when it comes to c4, it's much more active. And we're always trying to activate our pieces. It not only controls the same light square diagonal here on the f1 to a6 diagonal, but now it controls this long light square diagonal as well. If black responds with bishop here to e7, this does prepare to castle on the king side for black, but you can see that this bishop here on e7 is not as active as this bishop here on c4. You should always look to get your pieces involved into the game on very active squares. Bishops do really well when there's a lot of space that it can control in the game. And that usually happens when it's in the center of the board and there's not a lot of pieces blocking it to move all around the board. From here, white may castle on the king side, and then we could see pawn to a6, and then the rook comes here to e1. When we think about activating our rook, that typically means it's going to be behind one of your pieces in the center of the board, or it's going to be on an open file, which means there's no pawns on that file, or a semi-open file, meaning a pawn is off the board, and a rook is able to control half of that file without the pawn. Always be looking in your chess games to activate your material to squares where they can do the most damage. In this position, black is up 2 pawns in material. But white is winning because white has more active pieces. If we take a look at black's standpoint, you can see this rook here on a8. It's not moving anywhere, and it will take a few moves before this rook can go anywhere. This knight on b8 cannot go anywhere because it's trapped by all the pawns here on a6, c6, and d7. Same with the bishop here on c8. It's completely blocked in by the pawns here on b7 and d7. This bishop here on a7, it only has one move, and that's b6, because coming down to c5, and the bishop would fall to the pawn here on b4. The rook on g8 would really like to come to e8 so it can get involved into the game, but this e file is completely controlled by this rook here on e1. When we talk about activating your rook, you want to bring your rook so it controls ranks and files. This rook on e1 is controlling the open file, the e file. It's an open file because there are no pawns. This rook here on f1 is controlling this semi-open file. There's only one pawn here for black. There's no pawns for white, so it's a semi-open file. The rook's doing a very good job of controlling the game. They are very active pieces. The bishop here on b3 is also very active. It controls this long light square diagonal. It can also come to a4 if it ever needed to. The bishop here on f4 is also extremely active. It controls this long dark square diagonal, as well as this long dark square diagonal. The knight here on f5 is also very active. It controls a lot of the squares in the board. The more central a knight is in the game, the more squares that it can move to on the chessboard. In chess, you should always be thinking about how you can activate your pieces and get them involved into the squares where they can maximize their potential, and limiting the squares your opponent's trying to get to activate their pieces. If you can do this, you're well on your way to winning at chess.
Who alive can't put me in a box. I redefine any definition you got. I am the tiger, I'm making steps to the top. The flames, I whip it up, you just gotta hand me the rock. Take a seat, you cannot stand it. All I know, the flow harder than a scotch bunny. Don't try studying me.